Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to the final night of the WCG three-ring circus for a themed ring we're calling The Great Beyond. My name is Caitlin Mahoney. I'm a director at WCG and host for this evening. I'm speaking to you from Southeast Washington, DC, and I want to acknowledge that this is the ancestral homelands of the Nacotchtank and recognize that DC continues to be a gathering place for Indigenous peoples. Before we begin our talks, I believe there's some words from WCG leadership.
Oh, I can unmute myself. I keep forgetting I could do that to myself. Yeah, I want to welcome everybody here. I'm so pleased to see everybody that showed up for the third week in a row for our virtual three-ring circus. So sad we weren't able to meet in person, but you know, it is what it is. I don't have much to say, except that I would like to very quickly let you know that in addition to our monthly meetings, which will continue to be virtual for the foreseeable future, we are planning a couple of in-person workshops that should be a lot of fun. They'll be for a smaller group of people. One of them will be outdoors. It's a collodion plate, a wet plate collodion workshop. Sounds like a lot of fun. And that'll be late May, early June. We're also going to do Ed McManus's pewter spoon workshop again. That will be in April. And we haven't set a date yet. It's going to be mid-April. We'll let you know as soon as we do. We have a federal contracting webinar coming up also. Now that is virtual, obviously. And that is February 24th, and announcements have gone out about that already. And then we're also planning a material swap. That will probably be this summer, obviously in person. Fingers crossed that we will be that we'll be able to see each other face to face again, at least in these smaller gatherings. So I'm going to turn this meeting back over to Caitlin, and thank you again for coming.
Well, thanks, Jane. As a reminder, tonight's talks are being recorded and they'll be available on our website in the future. Please use the chat feature to place your questions for the speakers, and we have enabled live captioning. First up, we have Laura McNulty presenting Treatment of a 15th Century Illuminated Book of Hours. Laura is a Samuel H. Kress Conservation Fellow in the Department of Conservation and Preservation in the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins University. She graduated from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation in 2021, specializing in the conservation of library and archival materials. She's completed graduate internships at the Library of Congress and the National Museum of American History and Johns Hopkins University. I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Go ahead and share my screen. Thank you again, Caitlin, for that introduction, and I'm thrilled to be kicking off the last ring of this year's three-ring circus. I'll be presenting the treatment that I've nearly completed on a 15th century illuminated book of hours. The Lunenburg Book of Hours, named so for the book's owner, Hans Lunenburg, was completed in 1492 in the Low Countries, and like so many other books of hours, is small but bulky, and was made to fit easily into the hands of the user. Oh, sorry, my screen changed, I'm sorry. And the number of parchment leaves in this text block totals a whopping 245.
Laura, I'm just going to interrupt you. I think
Sure.
You stopped screen sharing.
Oh, maybe that's why my screen changed. All right. Try this again. How's that looking?
That looks good, but yep, perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay. So we know the date of completion, the owner of this book, and where it was produced, thanks to this record found on leaf 244 at the back of the text block. And if this colophon was not enough, there is also a small portrait of Hans Lunenburg, which includes his family's crest in the lower left corner of the illumination on the first page. This manuscript is truly a feast for the eyes. there are 67 full page and 9 partial page illuminations. There are 120 initials ranging in size and degree of detail from small and plain to large, gilded, and highly detailed and decorated. The Lunenburg Book of Hours is an incredible example of the high quality manuscript production in what scholars call the final phase of medieval manuscript illumination. The years between 1390 and 1540 saw a dramatic expansion to the production of illuminated manuscripts. Books of Hours especially enjoyed unprecedented popularity. Established centers of manuscript production were keenly aware of the developments in printing at the end of the 15th century. Not wanting to be outdone by the emerging technology, manuscript producers pulled out all the stops, and to use the words of art historian James Moreau, fashioned books of a richness and complexity that were beyond the capabilities of even the most ambitious printers. Little is known of the provenance of the Lunenburg manuscript. What is known is that it was part of the George Peabody Library in Baltimore, the interior of which is shown here, and it was donated to the library in 1909 by Michael Jenkins, who had been the treasurer of the Peabody Institute. In the 1920s, Seymour de Ritchie, an Anglo-French scholar, set out to create a complete guide to all the medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in the public and private collections in the US and Canada, and the Lunenburg Book of Hours is included in his survey. However, when a later survey of the manuscripts in the Peabody collection was completed in the 1960s, the Lunenburg manuscript was nowhere to be found. So at some point between the de Ritchie survey in the 1920s and the next survey in the 1960s, the Lunenburg Book of Hours was removed from the library. In 2007, a plain brown box was mailed to the Peabody Library, and when it was opened, the Lunenburg manuscript was there inside the box. Who removed the book from the Peabody Library, when they did so, why, and who returned it remains a mystery. In 2011, the manuscript was brought to the conservation lab for treatment, before treatment photos were taken and the book was disbound. The manuscript was slated to be part of the library's Adopt a Book program, but it seems that the book was not selected as further treatment was not performed. These before treatment photos taken in 2011 show that the sewing was no longer intact and folios were detached from the text block. Other condition issues included detached front and back boards and spine piece, broken end bands, and water damage to the spine lining, but not to the text block itself. The examination documentation indicates that there was some surface dirt that had accumulated on the text block, but on the whole, the text block was in good condition despite the binding being in poor condition. The examination also found the media to be secured to the parchment. For reasons unknown, further treatment was not performed until 2019. In 2019, my colleague, senior book conservator Alessandro Scola, began to treat the manuscript. The glue used on the spine folds and to adhere single leaves to adjacent bifolia was brittle and disfiguring, so it was reduced to the safest extent possible. The collation of the pages was also checked and confirmed by Alessandro, along with the curator of the collection and an outside expert. Alessandro created a gathering diagram of the text block and made notes about where and how leaves were joined together. When creating gathering diagrams, and this diagram of section 6 is what we tend to find. Some number of bifolia nicely nestled with one another to create the section. For the most part, this is what Alessandro found when documenting the text block. However, there are a few oddballs. Section 9 is a doozy. Not only are there 22 leaves in the section, but there are multiple single leaves and bifolia that were adhered to other folia in the section. By the end of the 15th century, there was an established practice in the Low Countries of painting a full page illumination on a separate leaf of parchment and then adhering it in its correct place in the text block. Section 10 also has many single leaves and bifolia adhered to adjacent leaves. The question then became, how should we address the single leaves and bifolia, which would originally been adhered to adjacent folia in the section? Before continuing with the description of the treatment, I need to mention that it is here that I picked up the treatment. When I began my fellowship, the manuscript in no way resembled a book, as the gatherings of the text block were individually housed. So the treatment steps I've described so far were done before my fellowship began, and the treatment steps that I'm about to describe were completed by me. So on the screen are two during treatment images, which show how I dealt with single leaves, which would have been originally adhered to adjacent leaves. Instead of adhering the leaves again, I added hooks and guards made of usumino, a medium weight Japanese tissue, which I adhered with a cold 5% gelatin mousse. Where it made sense to do so, single leaves were joined together with a guard so that they could be integrated into the text block by sewing, rather than by being re-adhered to adjacent leaves. On the left, we see a guard that I've added to join two single leaves, and on the right, a hook. The hooks were left oversized for sewing, but were later trimmed. I've documented where I've added guards and hooks. In the diagram on the screen, the red lines indicate where I've intervened. This documentation is included in my treatment report, so other conservators and future users of the book won't be confused about what is original and what I added during treatment. Here we see the text block after amending and adding the guards and hooks. Clearly, the next problem I had to solve was how to control the swell when sewing. The other issue to consider was how the text block would open. There are few illuminated manuscripts in the collections at Johns Hopkins, so this manuscript will be heavily used by curators, students, and researchers. I wanted to ensure that the sewing did not restrict the opening so that the book would easily and safely open, which would make using the book in classes or exhibitions less damaging and support the long-term preservation of the book. To help puzzle out a solution to these problems, I made 3 models. The first model was sewn with a herringbone stitch on commercially available cord, and I did not support the kettle. A herringbone stitch was chosen because it is strong and flexible, and through linking each gathering, the leaves are securely fastened and the spine is better consolidated. The second model that I made was again sewn with a herringbone stitch, but on hand-spun cords that I made rather than the commercially available cord. The hand-spun supports were made using linen sewing thread, which was twisted using a drill. The third and last model was sewn with a packed herringbone stitch on hand-spun cords and with a supported kettle. After evaluating the 3 models and feeling pleased about the lack of out-of-control swelling on all 3 models, it was decided to sew the manuscript with a herringbone stitch on hand-spun cords and to support the kettle. The sewing was not packed, which gave me the option to pack it after sewing if I felt the text block required it. A supported kettle was chosen so that the support could be laced into the boards and serve as another connection between the text block and the binding. The models also allowed me to figure out another problem that, to be honest, I created for myself. By adding hooks and guards in the way that I did, instead of adhering single leaves to adjacent leaves, I created what we would call subsections in the more complicated sections, such as section 9, which is on the screen. On the first model, I sewed the subsections with a 2-on abbreviated pattern, which required a lot of handling and manipulation of the paper. Heavy handling felt okay with the models, but I did not want to handle the manuscript in the same way. So with the next model, I sewed the subsections separately and all along. I sewed subsection A first and then subsection B. This method of sewing required less handling of the paper, and the section as a whole felt more secure. So having decided on a herringbone stitch on hand-spun double cords with a supported kettle and sewing the subsections all along, the sewing of the text block was completed. The text block opens easily, making it safe for use by curators, students, and researchers, and the swell was kept to a minimum. And if you're counting down from the top to find sections 9 and 10, I've saved you the trouble. There they are. So next, a slotted spine lining was made by laminating linen and a medium weight Japanese tissue. A back bead style end band was chosen and tied down in each section. The spine lining was not adhered to the spine fold of the text block, but instead was secured to the text block by the end band tie downs. This was done in order to avoid exposing the parchment spine folds to moisture. Due to time constraints, the final treatment steps presented in the next few slides were only completed on the model, but will be performed on the manuscript in the very near future. Boards were made by laminating 3 layers of binder's board, 2 thin and 1 thick. The boards were adhered together with wheat starch paste. Permalife was then pasted to the boards. 1 layer was pasted to the inside faces of the boards, and a second piece of Permalife was then wrapped around the whole laminated board structure. The boards were cut to size with a plow and shaped with a plane and sandpaper. Next, lacing in holes were drilled. On one model, 2 different lacing in patterns were used to compare the openability of the boards. Bifurcated lacing holes on the front board and straight lacing holes were made on the back board. The boards were then laced and the slips pegged with wooden skewers, and then everything was trimmed flush to the boards. The model was then covered with alum-tawed goatskin. Bound in a baggy back style, the leather was left unadhered at the spine, which creates a natural hollow. Here we see the Lunenburg manuscript before treatment on the left and the completed model on the right. Completing the binding on the model allowed me to work through issues of openability and ease of use while practicing my bookbinding skills before rebinding the manuscript. The same binding style and covering material will be used on the Lunenburg manuscript. After completing the treatment, the book will be housed in a custom-made clamshell enclosure, along with the earlier binding and the piece of the box in which the manuscript was returned to the Peabody Library. I had a lot of guidance and encouragement from my colleagues at Johns Hopkins. A special shout out to Jennifer and Mark, who took many hours out of their busy schedules to have discussions with me and walk me through the various steps of this treatment. And thank you to Alessandro, who got this treatment rolling again and for documenting that crazy text block. And to Lena and Michael, thank you for your enthusiasm and support. I'd also like to thank the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and the Harriet and Donlin Long Endowed Fund and Conservation for funding my fellowship. And a big thank you to all of you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions you may have.
Wow, that was really, it's an amazing treatment, and you're getting some comments in the chat saying as much. Laura, do you have enough time in your fellowship to complete what you've done on the model onto the, oh, that's great. I can't, yeah, good luck with that. It looks beautiful. And I appreciated the diagrams showing all the complexities of the subsections. Excellent. Well, if more questions do come in, oh, here we go. Mitch has a question for you. Do you have any record of previous rebinding or what the original might have looked like? Also, you sewed both of those subsections through the main section they were nested in, question mark?
Sure, you know, those are great questions. We don't have any sort of record of how it was originally bound. We just have the binding that it was probably likely in when it was donated to the Peabody. So with the subsections, okay, I'm trying to figure out how I can explain this without the model in my hand. So I took one subsection and I sewed it through the sewing holes and then through the sewing holes that were on the 3 bifolia that kind of encapsulated, for lack of a better term, the rest of the bifolia in the section. So I sewed those all along. And then for the next subsection, for subsection B, I did the same thing using the same sewing holes on those outer 3 bifolia. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. And Jen Munch also had a question that I was keeping in the back of my mind. She wanted to know what a gelatin mousse was. And then another question, what are the benefits of using the gelatin mousse in this treatment? Yeah, so since we were working with parchment, we really wanted to limit any sort of moisture that we used when working with the parchment. And a gelatin mousse, it's a
You cook the gelatin as you normally would, and then you let it cool. We put it in our fridge, and then we put it through a fine mesh strainer as if you were working with paste, that sort of thing. And then just used it, kind of worked it with our brush a little bit, and that was our adhesive.
That's great. Thank you so much for answering those questions. And look in the chat to see if any more come up as people digest. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have Maggie Bearden. She's presenting Rebooting the Suit, Research and Treatment of Alan Shepard's Mercury Spacesuit. Maggie is an objects conservator at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. She received both her BA and MS from the University of Delaware Winchester Museum Art Conservation programs. She has previously worked on conservation projects with focuses ranging from ethnographic to fine arts at institutions including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and Harvard's Peabody Museum. Her current focus is the treatment of artifacts in preparation for installation at NASM's Full Museum Transformation Project. Pass it over to you, Maggie.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Can everyone see it now?
Looks good, Maggie.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you for that introduction and for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about the conservation of Alan Shepard's Mercury spacesuit that we've been undertaking at the National Air and Space Museum, which I will refer to as NASM from here on out. The Reboot the Suit project began in 2015 as a Kickstarter project. For those who don't know, Kickstarter is a crowdfunding website that allows people to fundraise for activities or to produce new products. There are typically different levels of contributions available to participants, and different rewards are offered for different levels of contribution. The Kickstarter project originally began with the goal of raising $500,000 for the preservation of Neil Armstrong's Apollo 11 spacesuit. Once that goal was met, we next proposed an additional goal known as the stretch goal of raising $200,000 for the preservation of Alan Shepard's Mercury suit. Like the Armstrong suit, the Mercury suit is one of the most important in our collection, as it's the suit that Alan Shepard wore when he became the first American to enter space. That flight took place on May 5th, 1961, and was in the capsule Freedom 7, which you can see here. Some of you might be familiar with this space flight through movies such as The Right Stuff and Hidden Figures. Shepard's spacesuit was displayed for many years at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, but was returning to NASM as part of the museum's transformation project, which is the extensive renovation that we're currently completing at our mall location. Its accompanying space capsule, Freedom 7, is also returning from its most recent display at the JFK Presidential Library, and it will be reunited with the suit in our new displays. Like most conservation projects, when the suit was returning to the collection, we first and foremost wanted to assess the condition and ensure that any issues were addressed. And we wanted to create an updated mannequin to properly support the suit for its upcoming long-term display. However, by choosing the suit as a Kickstarter project, it also provided the opportunity to do some additional research and study that might not have otherwise been in the scope of our current transformation project deadlines. First, we wanted to delve a little deeper into the actual manufacturing process of the suit, as there's relatively little in the literature about this topic. Additionally, we also committed to producing 3D imaging of the suit as one of the product's Kickstarter supporters would be able to receive. And we also committed to producing periodic blogs that update our supporters on the research and treatment progress. Prior to this project, it was known that the Mercury suits were essentially a nylon Navy pilot Mark IV suit that had been aluminized. Some sources said that this silver coating served to reflect heat from the wearer, while others theorized it was really just added to make the suits look more spacey or impressive to contemporary audiences. While this is the most memorable feature of the Mercury suits, there was little information at NASM about what the coating actually was and how it was created. Historical research proved difficult at first, as the Mercury project coincides with the founding of NASA. So there's limited information in the NASA archives or documents about the initial production designs and contracts. It was documented that while the suits as a whole were made by B.F. Goodrich, the fabric was made by the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, today more commonly known as 3M. I discovered that the 3M company archives are now held at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. Prior to COVID, these archives were only accessible in person, and travel to Minnesota would not have been in the scope of our project. However, in a stroke of good luck, during the pandemic, the Historical Society developed a system for remote requesting of archival documents and provided delivery via PDF scans. When our requested documents arrived, they provided some great insight into the history of our coated fabric. The archives documented that this aluminized coated fabric was developed as a heat repelling fabric that was marketed primarily for firefighting, like seen here. The file also had some great images of the fabric being tested in the field in 1959. The product was called Scotch Shield and was described as a 5 millionth thick film of aluminum that was adhered to a substrate fabric in such a manner that it did not change the drape or flex of the fabric. Their testing indicated it would reflect about 90% of incident radiant heat. Beyond industrial applications, 3M also advertised that the product could be used as a trim for religious vestments, athletic clothing, and women's accessories. And here you can see a marketing ad with the fabric being portrayed in a much more sensual manner than it was portrayed in the industrial promos. During my research, I also uncovered a 3M US patent from 1952, which described the process for making a infrared reflecting metallic coated fabric. As seen in the patent diagram here, their process involved first taking a thin carrier fabric and then depositing a metallic coating onto this through a vapor chamber. A vapor deposition process in a vacuum chamber. The film then passed through an adhesive coater and next an oven, which removed any volatile solvents. The adhesive was then reactivated over a heated drum, and the fabric was attached at this point. Next, it went through another oven to cure the adhesive. And finally, the original carrier web was removed, and you were left with the flexible and reflective metallic fabric. The fabric would then be sent to B.F. Goodrich for assembly with the additional suit components. Now that we understood the production, we wanted to also understand a little bit more about the composition of the coating. Portable XRF with a vacuum was used to confirm the expected presence of aluminum, though the peak was a little difficult to obtain and rather small. However, we are initially very surprised by the high presence of zinc in this spectrum. Because the metallic coating is so thin, I began to wonder if the zinc might be related to the substrate fabric rather than the actual coating. To test this theory, I used XRF to also analyze a Mark IV glove from our collection, which is essentially the same nylon substrate as the Mercury suit, but without the metallic coating. When I compared the spectra, thankfully, they were very close. And the Mark IV suit was almost identical to that of the Mercury suit, just lacking the aluminum peaks. This confirmed my suspicions that the zinc was likely related to the fabric and not a primary component of the coating. We next turned to the actual condition assessment and treatment. I found the suit to be in very good condition, especially considering its long history of display. X-radiography of the interior revealed that the rubber-lined pressure bladder is in very good condition, and there are no areas of extensive cracking or loss. The X-rays also helped reveal the interior layout of the oxygen delivery system, which you can see here as a spiral line. The X-rays also helped reveal details about interior lacing on the legs, which allowed customization of the suit's fit and which were previously not visible from the exterior of the suit. Damage to the coating is one of the most common condition issues with the Mercury suits. In areas that the coating is missing, it often exposes this distinctive brown layer. Many people mistakenly believe that the suit is rusting when they see this brown layer, but this is actually the adhesive layer that I previously mentioned. Over time, it has aged to this brown appearance over the green substrate fabric. This Shepard suit has substantially less loss to the coating than some of our Mercury suits, possibly due to the short length of his initial space flight. Our coating thankfully did not exhibit any active flaking or areas of serious concern, and no compensation was undertaken in areas of loss. There was light corrosion present on some of the metal fixtures of the suit, such as the zippers and several of the hook and buckle components. This was addressed through a combination of solvent and mechanical reduction. The area of greatest concern on the suit was the rubber neck dam attached to the upper neck ring. This image of astronaut Gus Grissom demonstrates the stored position of the neck dam and how it would look when engaged. The neck dam was a rolled flexible rubber component that would be engaged when the astronaut landed in the ocean to prevent any water from entering the suit. Our rubber neck dam had degraded substantially over time, losing most of its flexibility and becoming stuck in rolled configuration. It had split in many areas and had substantial losses. Where the losses could be closed, the breaks were repaired with JDAR adhesive. Unfortunately, a majority of these losses could not be rejoined or closed. To prevent snagging and additional loss, these areas were encapsulated with toned silk crepeline that was adhered to the metal neck ring with JDAR adhesive. During treatment, one challenge we encountered was that the padding from the previous display mannequin had become lodged in the rubber socks of the suit and was stuck in place. The only interior suit access is at the chest, and even with extended tweezers and hemostats, we could not reach the padding for removal. We first tried to remove the padding by attaching our borescope to a Nilfisk vacuum and using low suction, but that proved ineffective. We were worried that the higher suction required to remove the padding would be too risky near the rubber socks. The solution we found was to instead wrap self-adhesive Velcro hook side out along the top of a thin metal tube. The borescope was then threaded through the tube and attached. We could then use this thin long tube to extract the padding piece by piece in a much safer process. By the end, we'd extracted a roughly 13 by 5 inch pile of padding from the two socks, and we're left with a much cleaner interior. I also addressed condition issues with the glove and boot components of the suit. In these images, you can see the stabilization of a tear on the inside of one of the boot tongues using adhesive silk crepeline that was reactivated in place with heat. Throughout the project, we've been sending periodic updates to our Kickstarter supporters to keep them informed of our findings and progress. These were produced not only by the conservation team, but also by our curator. During the project, we also had a visit from Adam Savage, formerly of Mythbusters. He is a huge Mercury project fan and has actually made his own replica Mercury suit, which you can see him wearing in the image on the right. He shared his visit with our labs in his current YouTube channel project called Tested. This was a great avenue for us to share the project with people who weren't getting updates through the Kickstarter project. While our treatment is complete, the project is still ongoing. We're currently working with our exhibition team to improve our spacesuit mannequin designs to ensure we have proper support as well as airflow for the off-gassing components on the interior. We also will be working with our digital imaging team to produce a 3D scan similar to the one that was developed for the Armstrong suit. Overall, this project has been an extremely rewarding experience. It was great to not only be able to stabilize the suit for the future, but also to uncover new information about its development and to share our work and findings so directly with the public. I would like to thank the many people at NASM who have made this project possible. Thank you to the Washington Conservation Guild for having me here tonight, and for all of you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Wow, thank you for that, Maggie. Congratulations on such a successful treatment. It's such an interesting object to work on too.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
I don't see any questions yet, so I'm gonna ask my own. I totally, when I first looked at the suit, misunderstood and thought there was corrosion happening on the surface. Was there any discussion, or did you wind up doing anything to tone those areas of loss, or just is that going to be like in a diagram or to notify the public what's happening? Or I'm always interested.
Yeah, so we decided not to tone any of it because that's kind of been the approach with most of those suits. A lot of it is considered to be wear from actual use. So we generally don't address that, but I'm not sure what the curator is actually putting on our copy label about it. I'm hoping she does address it in there because it is very confusing for people, and we don't want people to think that it's falling apart because it's actually in very good condition. So yeah.
Right, that's so exciting to hear and to see those x-rays. Susan has a question about if you can talk more about the mannequins. It was a very cool teaser image that you showed.
Yeah.
So how will it get in there?
Yeah, so it's very much still in development. That's actually this month. That's going to be our, well, this coming month is kind of the focus for that because we are hoping to install and very soon. Our old mannequin system was kind of like a metal, kind of like a stick figure man, really, that then had additional not so hard supports. So it was like metal framework that went through. And then the one that I took out of this mannequin, which was a very old model, it's not what we use on our current ones, actually had kind of like that mesh material you see at doctor's offices for like molding supports, which is not at all what we use today. So now this suit is actually a little bit different than our other space suits because it doesn't have all of the life-saving capacities of our modern suits. So modern suits have like 17 layers of things, and they have like urine collection systems and heat regulation systems. Since this suit is so old, it doesn't have any of that. It's just one layer. So it's a little lighter. So it doesn't need quite as heavy duty suit support as, say, the Armstrong mannequin, which was custom made. This one also produces unusual challenges in that most modern spacesuits zip up the back. This one only has access from the front and across the chest. So it's really hard to get a mannequin in there. We could have used just a Dorfman. We were able to see that a Dorfman would fit, though it's very close, but you really have to move the suit in ways you don't want to do that to get a Dorfman in there. And also it doesn't have the airflow we were looking for. So our exhibitions team is currently looking at possibly having some sort of like expanding chest piece. So it would go in and then you would expand it to the size you want and lock it so that it could go in very small without having to move the suit too much, but then would expand and provide all the support we need. We just saw his first version of that is what we saw in my teaser image. And we're waiting for next week. Hopefully we're going to see V2 because there were some issues with the first one. It was actually a little too big because Shepard was a very small man. But so we were looking at having an expanding part for the torso. The hips will probably be kind of more like a traditional Dorfman, but assembled in parts. And then the legs will probably be some sort of like metal rod, but then with supports periodically along the rod to provide adequate spacing. We're still developing it though, but that's our theory for now.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna combine two questions since we're on time, but two questions were, do you need to specify special exhibit conditions for the aluminum when it's on display? And then what do you know about what's off-gassing, and is it the rubber components?
So for this suit is actually going to be in its own case right next to, my understanding is there's going to be a large case for the actual capsule, and then this will be isolated within that case. I don't think it's going to have, I know Armstrong has a very particular atmospheric monitoring system in it, and I don't think we're doing quite the same thing with this suit. I don't think it was what is quite as necessary. So I don't think there's going to be anything particular due to the aluminum just in this object. And then as far as the off-gassing, I didn't do any type of monitoring with this. There are quite a few different rubber components though happening there. So it's definitely not something I would want. Once it's zipped, it's a fairly sealed, contained environment since it is a pressure suit. So it's one of those things we really just don't want it to be, if there is anything still off-gassing, though it is pretty old, you just want there to be some air exchange. And with the pressure suit environment, that can be a little difficult to maintain. So it's much easier if there's not just like a solid mannequin in there, just so that some natural air exchange might happening. We're not expecting, you know, terrible off-gassing from this because it is so old, but it's just nice to get a little air exchange since we don't get to go into the cases very often once they're installed.
Great points. Well, thank you so much. Fascinating talk. And if any more questions come up, please look in the chat, Maggie. Oops, I muted myself. Closing out, we want to give people another minute, but otherwise, thank you so much for presenting. Thank you to all our presenters tonight. It was an excellent way to finish up our 3-ring circus. And yes, just some comments in the chat. So I don't believe we have any more closing comments other than look for our announcements for our next meetings, for our upcoming workshops that Jane spoke to us about, which are super exciting to have some opportunities to do things in person. And yeah, everyone, kudos to you all on the work you've done over the past few years through the pandemic. It's exciting. See you all soon.